If you can't stand, maybe you shouldn't be lecturing this court about sacrifice." The words fell across the courtroom like a steel door slamming shut. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody even shifted in their seats. 25 pairs of eyes locked onto the woman in the wheelchair at the center of the room. Judge Richard Whitmore sat high above everyone else beneath the state seal, his expression calm, almost bored, as if he had delivered a simple observation instead of a public humiliation. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack marble. Angela Brooks lowered her gaze for only a second. Her fingers tightened around the worn rubber grip of her wheelchair. The fluorescent lights reflected softly off the silver rims beside her hands. She did not answer. She did not argue. She simply breathed. Around the courtroom, whispers began to spread. Some people glanced away in discomfort. Others watched with open curiosity. A reporter near the back slowly lowered her pen. A young law clerk froze with a stack of files pressed against his chest. Something about the moment felt wrong, as though everyone present had just witnessed a line being crossed without fully understanding why. Outside the tall courthouse windows, gray clouds drifted over downtown Richmond, muting the afternoon sunlight. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly above rows of polished wooden benches. Angela sat alone. No attorney stood beside her. No family member occupied the empty seat behind her. No crowd had arrived carrying signs or demanding attention. She looked exactly like the kind of person society learned to overlook. A middle-aged black woman. A wheelchair. A plain navy sweater. Shoes that had clearly seen better days. Nothing about her appearance suggested power. Nothing suggested influence. Nothing suggested that her name would matter to anyone in that room. Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers in front of him and glanced over the top of his reading glasses. "Do you have anything further to add before this court proceeds?" His tone remained formal, but the edge underneath it was impossible to miss. Angela slowly lifted her eyes. The courtroom clock ticked, loudly from the far wall. Her face revealed neither anger nor embarrassment. If anything, she seemed tired. Not the exhaustion of a long day, but the deeper weariness that comes from carrying memories nobody else can see. For a moment, her gaze drifted across the room. She studied the polished benches, the flags near the judge's platform, the spectators lining the walls. Then her eyes settled briefly on the last row near the rear exit. Several men sat there quietly. Different ages, different backgrounds, different clothes. Most people would never have noticed them. Angela did. A faint expression touched her face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Not a smile. More like recognition. More like gratitude. Then she turned back toward the judge. The room waited. The judge waited. Even the reporters seemed to stop breathing. And when Angela Brooks finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to cut through every whisper in the building. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I'm not here to talk about my sacrifice." The words lingered in the air long after Angela finished speaking. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. The judge frowned slightly, as though her answer had disrupted a script he expected her to follow. Angela rested her hands quietly in her lap. The courtroom saw a woman in a wheelchair. They saw gray beginning to touch the edges of her dark hair. They saw a simple sweater, a modest life, and a face marked by years of responsibility. What they did not see was the road that had brought her there. Nearly 18 years earlier, Angela Brooks had stood beneath an entirely different ceiling. Instead of fluorescent lights and polished wood, there had been endless desert skies stretching across the horizon in shades of gold and copper. She remembered the heat shimmering above the sand. She remembered early mornings when the sun painted the landscape with a soft amber glow before the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Most of all, she remembered the people. Men and women from every corner of America. Different accents, different backgrounds, different dreams waiting back home. They had become a family. The memory drifted through her mind like a photograph touched by time. She could still hear laughter around folding tables. Still see coffee steaming from metal mugs before dawn. Still remember young soldiers talking about newborn daughters, college plans, and small houses they hoped to buy someday. Through all those years, Angela had never been the loudest voice in any room. She was the person others trusted when things became difficult. The person who listened. The person who stayed calm. The person who remembered birthdays when everyone else forgot. Even now, those qualities remained. The judge interpreted her silence as weakness. He could not have been more mistaken. A shaft of afternoon sunlight slipped through the courthouse windows and settled across the polished floor. Tiny dust particles floated through the beam like drifting stars. Angela watched them for a moment. The sight reminded her of mornings spent on the front porch of her small Richmond home. A white rocking chair, flower boxes beneath the windows, wind chimes singing softly whenever a breeze crossed the yard. It was not a large house. It was not expensive, but every board and every flower bed carried a memory. Neighbors waved when they passed. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk. Veterans stopped by for coffee more often than they admitted. Many of them still called her Sergeant Brooks. Not because regulations required it, because respect did. Angela slowly turned her head toward the gallery. The men seated near the back remained quiet. Some stared at the floor. Others watched her carefully. Their expressions revealed something deeper than friendship. It was loyalty forged over years. Loyalty that could not be purchased and could not be demanded. One elderly veteran adjusted the brim of a faded cap resting in his hands. Another folded his arms and lowered his eyes. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The courtroom believed Angela Brooks had arrived alone. The truth was far more complicated. And before this day was over, everyone inside that room would understand exactly why she had come. Judge Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across the bench. The elevated seat seemed to make him larger than life, framed by polished oak panels and the state seal mounted high behind him. For nearly 20 years, he had built a reputation that filled courtrooms long before he entered them. Attorneys lowered their voices when his name appeared on a docket. Reporters filled notebooks whenever he presided over a controversial case. He was respected, feared, and rarely questioned. To many people in Richmond, Richard Whitmore represented authority itself. Yet authority had become a comfortable thing. Too comfortable. The courtroom had become a place where he expected compliance, expected order, expected people to fit neatly into the assumptions he formed within moments of seeing them. As he studied Angela Brooks, he believed he understood her story already. A disabled woman, a complaint against a government agency, another emotional appeal asking the court to intervene. He had seen hundreds of similar cases, or at least he thought he had. The attorneys seated at the long tables below shared his confidence. A polished man in a charcoal suit adjusted his tie and glanced toward Angela with a faint expression of impatience. Beside him, stacks of folders sat perfectly organized, each marked with colored tabs and legal citations. Numbers filled those pages. Budgets, policies, procedures. To them, the case was simple. Funding reductions, administrative decisions, necessary adjustments. Nothing personal, nothing emotional. Across the room, sunlight shifted slowly across the hardwood floor. The golden beam crept closer to Angela's wheelchair, while the clock above the courtroom door ticked steadily forward. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through downtown Richmond. The city continued its ordinary afternoon without knowing what was unfolding inside the courthouse. Judge Whitmore opened a file and scanned several pages. His eyes moved quickly. Then he closed the folder and tapped it once against the bench. "The court is prepared to proceed," he announced. His voice carried easily through the chamber. The spectators straightened in their seats. Several reporters prepared their pens. Angela remained still, calm, patient, almost impossibly patient. The contrast irritated him, more than he realized. Most people became nervous under pressure. Most people rushed to defend themselves when challenged. Angela didn't either. She simply listened. Her composure felt like resistance wrapped in courtesy. Near the back row, the quiet men continued watching. One wore a neatly pressed blue blazer with a small American flag pin attached to the lapel. Another carried a weathered leather folder resting across his knees. A third sat with silver hair and broad shoulders despite his age. They appeared unrelated. Strangers gathered by coincidence. That was how they looked to everyone else. Judge Whitmore never gave them a second glance. His attention remained fixed on Angela. He believed she was the center of the story. He did not realize she was only the beginning. The real story sat silently behind her, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And with every passing minute, that moment moved closer. Angela Brooks lifted her chin slightly and looked toward the bench. The late afternoon light painted soft gold reflections across the courtroom windows, turning the glass into mirrors that caught fragments of every face in the room. Her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, Before you make a decision, I am asking for something very simple. Let me tell their story. The request seemed almost too small for the tension filling the chamber. Judge Whitmore narrowed his eyes. Their story, he asked. Angela nodded. The people this decision affects. A faint sigh escaped from one of the attorneys seated nearby. Papers shifted. Pens tapped against legal pads. Several spectators exchanged impatient glances. They expected legal arguments. They expected statutes and procedural debates. Instead, a woman sitting alone in a wheelchair was asking for permission to speak about people. The contrast felt uncomfortable. Judge Whitmore glanced at the clock mounted above the courtroom door. You have 5 minutes, he said. Make them relevant. Angela offered a quiet thank you. Then she turned slightly, her gaze drifting across the rows of benches. For a moment, she seemed to be looking far beyond the courthouse walls. 3 years ago, she began, a veteran named Michael. Reynolds lost access to the specialist who had treated him for nearly a decade. He never complained, never asked for sympathy. He just wanted enough support to keep volunteering at the elementary school near his home. The room grew still. Another veteran, Samuel Ortiz, spent every Saturday repairing wheelchairs for people who could not afford new equipment. He never charged $1. Angela paused briefly, and there was Robert Jenkins. He delivered meals to elderly neighbors every Christmas morning because he said nobody should feel forgotten during the holidays. The attorney at the opposing table frowned. None of these names appeared in the legal documents stacked before him. Yet people were listening. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Angela continued. One story became another. A father, a teacher, a volunteer, a grandfather. Ordinary Americans whose lives had become tangled inside budget cuts and policy decisions made hundreds of miles away. She never raised her voice, never pleaded, never dramatized. She simply spoke with quiet certainty. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated the courthouse lawn. Inside, the golden glow stretched farther across the floor until it reached the front wheels of Angela's chair. Judge Whitmore listened despite himself. Something about her delivery made interruption difficult. She was not asking the court to feel sorry for anyone. She was asking the court to see them. Near the back row, several of the quiet men lowered their heads. One rubbed his thumb across the edge of a worn photograph. Another stared toward the window, blinking slowly. Their expressions carried memories nobody else in the room understood. Angela noticed them, but continued speaking. Most people will never know their names, she said softly. Most people will never know what they sacrificed after coming home. Her eyes moved briefly toward the last row. But they are here today. A strange silence followed. Not awkward, not empty, heavy, meaningful. And for the first time since the hearing began, the courtroom no longer felt divided between power and weakness. It felt like something larger was quietly beginning to reveal itself. The silence deepened after Angela's final words. Even the attorney representing the agency seemed uncertain whether to object or remain quiet. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file again, searching for something concrete, something procedural, something that would pull the hearing back into familiar territory. Instead, he found himself listening. Angela folded her hands gently and continued. Most of these men and women never asked for recognition, she said. They built businesses, raised families, coached little league games, sat through school concerts. They came home and tried to live ordinary lives. Her voice carried across the courtroom with remarkable calm. What they needed was not applause. They needed consistency. They needed promises kept. A reporter near the aisle slowly set down her pen. She realized she had not written a single note during the last several minutes. Around her, other spectators sat motionless. The usual sounds of a courtroom had faded away. No rustling papers. No whispered conversations. No impatient sighs. Only Angela's voice and the steady ticking of the wall clock. Outside, sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby buildings, sending flashes of gold into the courtroom. The light settled across the polished wood benches and illuminated floating specks of dust that drifted lazily through the air. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost sacred. Angela glanced briefly toward the back row again. The quiet men remained seated. One looked down at his hands. Another stared toward the judge. A third held a folded cap against his chest. Their faces carried the weight of years, but also something else. Trust. The kind that survives distance, hardship, and time. Judge Whitmore finally leaned forward. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his tone firmer now, "this court understands your concern. However, personal stories do not determine legal outcomes." Several attorneys nodded immediately. The statement sounded reasonable, expected, familiar. Angela lowered her eyes for a moment. Then she looked back up. "No, Your Honor," she replied softly. "But people do." The answer landed with surprising force. The judge's jaw tightened slightly. He was accustomed to arguments. He was accustomed to emotional appeals. What unsettled him was her complete absence of anger. She never challenged his authority, never raised her voice, never demanded sympathy. She simply refused to let the people behind the paperwork become invisible. The courtroom clock advanced another minute. Sunlight shifted farther across the floor. Somewhere outside, a distant church bell rang. Angela took a slow breath. "You asked why I came here today," she said. "The truth is, I almost did not." For the first time, genuine curiosity appeared on several faces. Even Judge Whitmore looked up. Angela's eyes moved once more toward the back row. Her expression softened. "Because I knew they would be here." A strange feeling passed through the room. Nobody understood what she meant. Not yet. But the men seated in the last row did. And one by one, their eyes lifted toward her with quiet respect. The room remained suspended in silence after Angela's last words. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Nobody seemed willing to break whatever invisible thread had settled across the courtroom. Judge Whitmore glanced down at the papers before him, but the numbers and legal language suddenly felt distant. The hearing had begun as a matter of policy. Somehow it had become something else. Sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows, warming the polished floorboards and casting long golden reflections beneath the benches. The afternoon had softened. Even the shadows appeared gentler now. Angela sat quietly in her wheelchair, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had spent years learning that the strongest voice in a room was not always the loudest. Sometimes it was the one that refused to surrender its dignity. Her gaze drifted toward the back row once again. The men sitting there did not look extraordinary. One wore a brown jacket that had clearly survived many winters. Another carried reading glasses tucked into a shirt pocket. A third sat with both hands folded around a faded military cap. Ordinary men. Men people passed every day without a second thought. Yet there was something unusual in the way they watched Angela. Not admiration alone. Not gratitude alone. Something deeper. Something earned. One of them, an older man with silver hair and weathered features, lowered his eyes briefly before looking back toward the front of the courtroom. The movement caught Angela's attention. A memory surfaced. A bright morning years earlier. A hospital room filled with sunlight. A nervous young father holding photographs of a newborn daughter. The same man now sitting quietly in the last row had once spent an entire afternoon talking about that little girl. Angela smiled faintly before the memory faded. Judge Whitmore noticed the expression. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "you appear very confident these individuals support your position." Angela turned back toward him. "I am confident they support each other, Your Honor." The answer landed softly, yet its meaning lingered. A reporter slowly looked toward the back row. Then another. For the first time, several spectators seemed genuinely interested in the men Angela kept mentioning. The attorney representing the agency shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had prepared arguments. He had prepared statistics. He had not prepared for this atmosphere. He had not prepared for a courtroom full of people quietly reevaluating what mattered. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees lining the courthouse square. Their shadows danced across the windows like gentle waves. Inside, the clock advanced another minute. Tick, tick, tick. The sound seemed louder than before. Angela rested one hand against the armrest of her chair. Her fingers brushed a small silver bracelet she always wore. It caught the sunlight for a moment and reflected a tiny flash across the wood floor. She thought about all the years that had passed. The birthdays, the reunions, the phone calls, the promises made between people who understood hardship without needing explanations. The men behind her represented those years. They represented chapters of a story that nobody else in the room had read. Not yet, but the moment was approaching. Angela could feel it. The quiet men could feel it too. One by one, their attention shifted from her to the judge. And although nobody moved, the entire courtroom seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. The ticking clock stopped being the loudest sound in the courtroom. A chair shifted near the back row. Then another. Judge Whitmore looked up, mildly irritated by the interruption. The attorney at the agency table turned as well. Every head in the room followed the movement. The silver-haired man who had been holding the faded military cap slowly rose to his feet. His jacket hung neatly from broad shoulders, shaped by decades of discipline. He cleared his throat and looked directly at the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "I know this is unusual, but I cannot sit here and listen without speaking." The courtroom froze. Judge Whitmore frowned. "Sir, this is not the time for testimony." The man nodded respectfully. "Maybe not, but I owe this woman more than silence." His eyes shifted toward Angela. For the first time all afternoon, emotion appeared on his face. 20 years ago, my daughter almost grew up without a father. Mrs. Brooks made sure that did not happen. The room went still. Before anyone could respond, another chair moved. A second man stood, then a third, then a fourth. One after another, men from different rows began rising. Some wore business suits. Some wore work jackets. One carried a cane. Another wore a neatly pressed polo shirt with a small American flag stitched above the pocket. None of them looked at each other. None of them needed a signal. They simply stood. The sound echoed softly across the hardwood floor. A reporter's pen slipped from her fingers and landed on her notebook. Nobody noticed. The attorney representing the agency stared in disbelief. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. His expression changed for the first time since the hearing began. More men rose. 5, 8, 12, 15, 20. The movement spread through the courtroom like a wave. Finally, 25 men stood facing the front of the room. 25 silent figures. 25 lives. 25 stories connected by one woman sitting quietly in a wheelchair. Angela lowered her eyes. She looked almost embarrassed by the attention. The silver-haired veteran spoke again. "You asked what relevance she has." His voice trembled slightly. "The answer is standing right here." Another man nodded. "She helped me when nobody else knew I was struggling." A third added softly. "She answered the phone every time I called." Another swallowed hard before speaking. "My grandson knows me because she refused to give up on me." The statements came from different corners of the room. Short, simple, honest. No rehearsed speeches. No dramatic performance. Just truth. Judge Whitmore glanced down at Angela's case file, then back at the 25 men standing before him. For the first time all day, the paperwork seemed small. The sunlight pouring through the windows illuminated the room in warm gold. It reflected from the polished floor and settled across the faces of the men who remained standing. Angela finally looked up. Her eyes moved across each of them. A faint smile touched her face. Not pride, not victory, gratitude, the kind that cannot be measured. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood the same thing. The woman they thought was alone had never been alone at all. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The 25 men remained standing, their presence transforming the atmosphere of the courtroom more effectively than any argument ever could. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter now, washing the room in warm gold and softening the sharp edges of polished wood and stone. Judge Whitmore looked from one face to another. He saw business owners, teachers, retirees, community volunteers, men who carried themselves with quiet dignity. None of them appeared interested in attention. None of them seemed motivated by anger. They had stood because they believed silence would have been wrong. The realization settled heavily over the courtroom. Judge Whitmore slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the bench. The gesture was small, yet everyone noticed. Throughout his career, he had relied on facts, procedures, and written records. Yet no document in the file before him explained what he was seeing now. He opened Angela's case folder again. This time he read more carefully. Additional records sat clipped. Behind the primary documents, letters of recommendation, community service recognitions, volunteer awards, mentorship acknowledgments from veteran organizations across the state. Page after page revealed a life devoted to helping others rebuild theirs. The judge turned another page, then another. His expression gradually changed. A reporter in the front row noticed and quietly lowered her camera. The room had become too personal for spectacle. Angela remained exactly where she had been all afternoon. Calm, humble, patient. She never interrupted, never pointed out what the judge was discovering. She allowed the truth to speak for itself. One of the standing veterans cleared his throat softly. "Your Honor," he said, "most of us are here today because she never stopped showing up for people." Several heads nodded immediately. Another man smiled faintly. When everyone else moved on, she stayed. The words hung in the air. Judge Whitmore closed the folder slowly. The sound echoed across the silent chamber. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Angela without assumptions clouding his judgment. What he saw now was entirely different from what he thought he had seen earlier. He saw resilience. He saw leadership. He saw a woman who had spent years lifting others without asking for recognition in return. The judge inhaled deeply before speaking. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly. The sharp edge that had once colored his voice was gone. "It appears this court has learned more today than it expected." Angela met his gaze. Her expression remained kind. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Simply kind. That made the moment even more powerful. Judge Whitmore looked down briefly, gathering his thoughts. Then he straightened. "I believe I owe you an apology." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The attorneys exchanged glances. Reporters froze. The 25 men remained standing. Angela blinked once, but said nothing. The judge continued. "I made assumptions before understanding who you were and what you represent. That was a mistake." The room grew even quieter. Outside, the clouds had fully parted. Sunlight filled the courthouse windows, illuminating every face present. And in that warm afternoon glow, authority finally gave way to humility. No one moved for several seconds after Judge Whitmore finished speaking. The apologies seemed to settle over the courtroom like warm sunlight after a long storm. Angela Brooks looked at him quietly, her dark eyes reflecting neither resentment nor triumph. She simply nodded once. The gesture was small, but it carried more grace than any speech could have. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sky had turned brilliant blue. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows and painted golden rectangles across the floor. Inside, the tension that had filled the room for hours slowly dissolved. Judge Whitmore straightened the papers on his bench before setting them aside altogether. For the first time that day, the documents no longer seemed like the most important thing in front of him. The people did. The 25 veterans remained standing. Some smiled softly. Others blinked away emotions they preferred not to discuss. Years had placed silver in their hair and lines around their eyes. Yet in that moment they looked united by something timeless. Loyalty, respect, gratitude. Angela turned her wheelchair slightly and faced them. Her expression softened. Memories seemed to pass silently between them. Community events, phone calls, hospital visits, holiday gatherings, long conversations over coffee, moments that never appeared in newspapers and never earned public recognition. Moments that mattered anyway. One veteran placed his cap over his heart. Another followed. Then another. Soon every man standing in the room held his cap against his chest. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The simple gesture carried more meaning than applause ever could. A reporter lowered her camera completely. She realized there were moments too human to reduce to headlines. Near the front row, a young law clerk watched in silence. He knew he would remember this day for the rest of his career. Not because of a ruling, not because of a legal argument, because he had witnessed dignity refuse to disappear. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. His voice was quieter now. "This court will review the matter with the consideration it deserves." He paused before adding, "And Mrs. Brooks, thank you for reminding us what those words actually mean." Angela smiled gently. "Thank you, Your Honor." The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Yet somehow the sound felt different now. Softer, lighter. The hearing eventually concluded. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. People began preparing to leave. But nobody rushed toward the exits. The atmosphere remained calm, almost reverent. Angela guided her wheelchair toward the center aisle. As she passed, the veterans remained standing. Sunlight reflected from the polished floor beneath them, surrounding the scene with a warm glow. Angela moved slowly between the rows. Several men nodded. A few smiled. One whispered, "Thank you." She answered with the same quiet kindness she had shown all day. Then she continued toward the courthouse doors. When the doors finally opened, bright afternoon light poured inside. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from the square outside. Angela rolled forward without looking back. Behind her, 25 veterans still stood in respectful silence. Ahead of her, sunlight stretched across the sidewalk like a welcoming path. And as she disappeared into the golden afternoon, the courtroom remained perfectly still, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something far greater than a victory. They had witnessed character. They had witnessed humility. They had witnessed the quiet strength of a woman who never needed to stand in order to rise above everyone else.